Before we start a conversation on what is public international law and why should we care about it, let's first clarify what is law. Law is a system of rules that are created by a controlling authority and enforced to regulate behavior of the members of society. And it has two primary functions. One is the prevention of wrongful behavior, and the other is the punishment of wrongful behavior. One distinction that we can make is private law versus public law. Private law is characterized by the horizontality of relations. It is the individual versus another individual or a company versus company. Think of contract law or property law. Public law, on the other hand, is characterized by the verticality of relations. It is the state versus individual or the state versus company. Examples would be criminal law or tax law. Another distinction is national law versus international law. National law exists within a particular state. Rules on how to become a civil servant or how much is paid in taxes, these are matters of national law. International law governs relations between different states. Think of trade relations between states or the prohibition of genocide. And lexicon concentrates on public international law. But why should we even care about it? Well, because it directly affects our lives. Let's say you wake up in the morning somewhere in Paris and you want to have your chia seed pudding for breakfast. And the whole travel of chia seeds from Central America to Europe is governed by international law through international trade agreements, agreements on taxes, main principles governing the international legal system. So let's begin. Number one, international law is state-centered. So international law regulates the conduct of states as main actors on international scene. Responsibility of international organizations and transnational corporations also became quite topical in the last decade. However, international legal instruments still traditionally address states. Number two, there is no single authority in international law. So in the national legal system, on top of the hierarchy, you have the president, the monarch if you wish, or the government. In the international legal system, there is no such authority. This means that the national system is vertical and centralized, whereas the international legal system is horizontal and decentralized. So there is no central body making law or enforcing law. Number three, international law is based on state consent. To define, consent is a legal or official permission to do something or an agreement as to action or opinion. And international law is based on state consent. As there is no single lawmaking or enforcing authority, states need to agree to assume legal obligations. Number four, responsibility is collective. So in the national legal system, we speak about individual responsibility. A person who commits a crime is then individually responsible for it. In the international legal system, we speak about state responsibility, which by its nature is collective. The whole state is liable as a single legal entity. So if a national court or a military general, they disregard international law, we speak about state responsibility. There is also a notion of individual criminal responsibility in international law. It is possible for especially grave violations of international law, war crimes, crimes of genocide, and so on, but this is not the topic for today. Number five, sovereign equality of states. The essence of the rule is that all states have equal rights and duties and are equal members of the international community irrespective of their differences of an economic, social, political, or other nature. States have to respect the personality of other states. Number six, non-intervention in the internal affairs of another state. It means that states do not have the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal affairs of any other state. So the examples would be encouraging overthrow of active government, inciting political destabilization, financing terrorist activities, economic pressure or coercion. But still the last one is quite vague because the withdrawal of economic aid is not necessarily a violation per se. Number 7, the use of force is prohibited with very limited exceptions. So Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations provides that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Are there any exceptions? Well, yes, there are two. First one, collective action for protection of international peace and security, which is governed by Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And second, individual or collective self-defense if armed attack occurs, Article 51 of the UN Charter. Number 8, preserving peace and respect for human rights is key. So the Second World War brought not just the physical destruction of cities and damage to economies, but also enormous human suffering. And so after war, there was an understanding that human life is truly valuable. This is also reflected in Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which provides that the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security and to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and then to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all. Today we will finally speak about sources of international law, but first a little bit of history. So in 1920, the League of Nations is established. It had its own judicial organ, which was called the Permanent Court of International Justice. After the Second World War in 1945, the United Nations is established together with its own court, the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. And the year after, the PCIJ, the previous court, got completely replaced by the ICJ. And the Statute of the International Court of Justice, Article 38, contains sources of international law. It says, the court whose function is to decide in accordance with international law such disputes as are submitted to it shall apply. International conventions, whether general or particular, establishing rules expressly recognized by the contesting states. International custom as evidence of a general practice accepted as law. The general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. And finally, judicial decisions and the teachings of the most highly qualified publicists of the various nations. Let's begin with the international conventions, which are in fact treaties. Treaty is an international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law. So, whether general or particular means that it can have any subject matter. Establishing rules expressly recognized by the contesting states, this means then when signing a treaty, states have themselves agreed to these rules. Here are some examples of the treaties that you definitely have heard of. 20th century, 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then the United Nations Charter, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty establishing NATO, or the Schengen Agreement. 21st century treaties, the Minsk Protocol of 2014, Paris Climate Agreement, or the Brexit Withdrawal Agreement. Let's now move towards custom. Evidence of a general practice accepted as law. As you can see, it has two elements. First, general practice, when certain practice becomes common among states. And second, accepted as law, when there is a belief that a certain practice is a legal obligation. This is called opinio juris. So we have a legal area of a problem, and let's say part of it is regulated by a written or a codified treaty. And so customary international law would govern parts that are not governed by a treaty. General principles of law. They're quite abstract in nature because the content is not written down and there is no precise list of such principles. But to give you some examples, good faith principle, that the conduct shall be honest and fair, respect for human dignity, that protection of human rights is an important principle of humanitarian and human rights law, principle of proportionality that certain measures, be it court measures, punishment, certain interference, or anything else, shall be proportionate to the purpose that it aims to achieve. In fact, two approaches exist here. First approach provides that treaty law, customary international law, and general principles of law are all separate and autonomous. The second approach provides that the general principles of law are part of treaty law and customary international law. You decide which one you agree with. Finally, judicial decisions and the teachings of the most highly qualified publicists. Article 38 itself provides that these are subsidiary means for the determination of rules of law. So these are traditionally viewed as supplementary means used for interpretation, application, and development of law. There is a distinction between primary and secondary sources, and some authors claim that treaties and custom are primary and then the rest are secondary sources. However, the approach of the International Law Commission is that general principles of law also fall under primary sources of international law. Is there any hierarchy among these? No. Main or primary sources of international law are not in a hierarchical relationship among themselves. So treaty law, customary international law, and general principles of law are all equal.